I've heard dozens of times from Muslims that Muhammad is the prophet foretold in Deuteronomy 18. Verse 15 of that chapter says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites." Now, contrary to Deuteronomy 18:15, Muhammad was not a descendant of the Israelites. He was not a Jew, and he didn't think too highly of the Jews, to put it nicely. He cursed them repeatedly, even with his dying breaths. He commanded they be expelled from the Arabian Peninsula and issued blanket orders for their execution, according to the earliest existing biography. And along with Allah in the Quran, he believed that various species of animals were descendants from Jews who had been cursed. You can see my video on snakes, mice, and Jews for more information on that topic. Now, in addition to Deuteronomy 18:15, verse 20 of the same chapter says, "But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded is to be put to death." Now, much to the embarrassment of modern Muslims, the early Muslims claimed that Muhammad recited satanic verses. If Muhammad existed in Moses' day, he would have been put to death. These are two significant reasons why Muhammad is precisely the opposite of the type of prophet foretold in Deuteronomy 18. So who is the prophet like Moses? Well, ultimately, it's Jesus Christ himself. Let's look at some parallels. They were both endorsed by God. "Now I am sending you," that is Moses, "to the king of Egypt, so that you can lead my people out of this country." And multiple times in the Gospel of Mark, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And during the Transfiguration account, "Listen to him." The waters of the Red Sea and baptism. "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land." Analogous to the waters of the Red Sea, Jesus emerged from the waters of his baptism. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Now, interestingly, the same Greek word in Mark's Gospel and the Septuagint for Exodus 14 is used for both the dividing of the Red Sea and the dividing or the tearing open of the heavens in Mark 1, 9, and 10. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years and Jesus for 40 days. In Numbers 32:13, the Lord's anger burned against Israel and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And in Mark 1:13, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. They were both tested in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 8:2, "Remember the Lord your God led you all the way into the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you." Mark 1:13, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by Satan. Miracles of food in the wilderness. "Then the Lord said to Moses, Look, I am going to rain down food from heaven for you." Exodus 16. Jesus performed 2 feeding miracles in the Gospel of Mark. I have one of those listed in Mark chapter 6. About this, it's interesting to note that Jesus said, "Verily, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven," recalling the miraculous feeding of the Israelites in the wilderness, "but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. I am the bread of life." Moses expounded the law in Deuteronomy chapter 1, as did Jesus. There are numerous examples of this throughout the Gospels. I just have one listed from Mark 1:21. You could also see Matthew 5. There are some more examples additionally that I'll cite below. The serpent in the wilderness. "Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived," from Numbers 21. "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up," said Jesus in John chapter 3. In addition to Jesus being pictured with Moses during the Transfiguration in Mark chapter 9, there are many more parallels just in this single event. They were both in mountainous locations. Of course, the Mount Sinai, and Jesus in the Transfiguration was also on a mountainous location in Mark 9:2. Moses' face shone, Jesus' clothes shone. There were 3 named companions who accompanied Moses, as with Jesus. There is an appearance of divine glory in both accounts. In both Exodus and Mark, a cloud appears. There's a 6-day period mentioned in both accounts, and in both accounts, God speaks. In John 5, Jesus says, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." Now, what does it mean that Moses wrote about Jesus? Well, ultimately, the Mosaic Law is about the God of Moses, the God of Israel. It reminds Israel how God delivered them miraculously from the bondage of the Egyptians, and about how God is a warrior. He drove out the enemies from before them to protect the nation. It reminds them of the covenant that God made with Abraham and the covenant that Israel entered into with God, and what they had to do to keep this covenant and to remain in God's protective care. It reminds them how God thinks of sin and the seriousness of it. See, ultimately, Moses wrote about Jesus not just as a prophet like himself, but Moses wrote about Jesus when he was writing about the God of Israel. Just as there are striking parallels between Jesus and Moses, there are striking parallels between Jesus and the God of Moses. Let's look at some of these examples. God abounds in kindness and truth, Exodus 34. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, John 1. Marriage language of adultery and jealousy and the bride and groom is used of God and His people throughout the Old Testament. Exodus 34 provides an example from the Torah. Do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods, and it goes on to condemn their practices. Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. There are numerous examples of this bridegroom language in the Old Testament, and the marriage language in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. This is just one example. The Lord came down from heaven in the Old Testament. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jesus in John 6, I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but of the will of him who sent me. God is a warrior, defending his people. Obey what I command you. I will drive out before you the Canaanite nations. And in John 12, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. God revealed the meaning of his name. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Jesus in John 17, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. Further, Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one. I protected them and kept them safe by the name you gave me. The God of Moses is the divine lawgiver. There are many such examples in the Torah. I've just listed one, the Ten Commandments, of course, in Exodus 20. And Jesus in John 13, a new command I have given you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. The Passover was a feast in the Old Testament to commemorate God's miraculous deliverance of his people from Egypt through Moses. And in Exodus 12:11, there is a description of how the Passover is to be practiced. And at the time of the Passover in Jerusalem, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take it, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. Just as the Passover called to remembrance God's miraculous deliverance of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, so Jesus' institution of his remembrance feast, commemorating the new covenant, recalls his miraculous deliverance of his people from the power of sin and death. Given all of these parallels, there's no wonder that Jesus turned to Moses and the prophets to explain everything that was written concerning himself. Peter agrees, now, fellow Israelites, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders, but this, referring to Jesus' death and resurrection, is how God fulfilled what he had foretold through all the prophets, saying that his Messiah would suffer. For Moses said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. For Jesus, Peter, and the other New Testament writers, the law and the prophets ultimately pointed to Jesus Christ, the divine Messiah himself. And with all of the parallels, it's very easy to see why. But the parallels don't just stop at Jesus and Moses. Again, Jesus is also compared to the God of Moses. Just as the God of the Exodus was full of grace and truth, so the God of the new Exodus, that is Jesus, was full of grace and truth. Just as Moses beheld God's glory on Sinai, so the contemporaries of Jesus in first century Palestine beheld his glory. Just as the God of Israel revealed his name, that is his nature, his presence to the Israelites, so Jesus made God's name known to his contemporaries in John 17. Just as God was a divine warrior driving out the enemies of Israel, so Jesus was a divine warrior who defeated the Lord of the dead and the Lord of sin himself, that is, Satan. Just as God initiated a new covenant relationship with his people, so did Jesus. And Jesus even instituted a new Passover feast to commemorate it. The parallels between Jesus and Moses are striking, and the parallels between Jesus and the God of Moses are striking and unavoidable. To Muslims who want to say that Muhammad is the prophet in Deuteronomy 18, is to draw superficial parallels between largely irrelevant details of the life of Moses and Muhammad, and to ignore the very significant theological, narrative, and thematic parallels that I bring up in this video. In short, to say that Muhammad is the prophet in Deuteronomy 18 is only a very weak attempt by modern Islamic apologists to vindicate Allah's claims in the Quran that Muhammad is prophesied in the Torah. But Muhammad is not in Deuteronomy 18, and he's not in the Torah. He's not now, and he never was.